We're making a bit of history today, folks. Today is Season 1, Episode 1 of the official Bergen Community College podcast. I am Dr. Larry Levanka, the host of said podcast, and I have a wonderful guest who you will meet in a few seconds' time. But first, let's lay the groundwork for what Bergen Banter, the official Bergen Community College podcast, is all about. This is an opportunity for the college to talk about interesting things, talk about things that are happening in our world, whether that's in politics, the sciences, the arts, and bring our incredible faculty that we have at Bergen Community College in as experts to provide commentary and analysis on all of these different topics. So I talked about making history before, that this is a history-making day for us, Season 1, Episode 1 of the college's official podcast. Who better than to bring in a terrific history professor, Dr. Christine Eubank, who is my guest today. She's also a women's studies professor. And that point is going to be relevant for our topic. Our first topic today is one that I think a lot of people wonder about and have some curiosity about. And that is women as leaders, as heads of state, politics, and throughout history. Obviously, we just went through the 2024 election cycle where Vice President Kamala Harris unsuccessfully ran for president and lost to President-elect Donald Trump. And there's obviously a lot of things related to that run-up and that process that we will get into. But Dr. Eubank, let's start where it began, or let's go back in time. Women have been leaders throughout history. This is not some new concept that a female can be a head of state, right? There's plenty of examples of women leaders out there.
Yeah, there are. There are many, many examples of women in history who have held formal leadership. I don't know how far back you want to go, but typically, when you're looking at the scope of human history and the scope of organized societies, complex societies where there's a ruler and the ruled, that typically tends to be male-dominated. The women, when they are in positions of formal political leadership, tend to be the exception rather than the rule. And historically, their access to formal political leadership is mediated by their relationship to powerful men. So, for example, one of the first in human history that we know of powerful female leaders was Enheduanna from the Assyrian Empire, the 2500 before the Common Era. She was not the king, but she was a powerful temple priestess, and she ruled that temple for, half a century, quarter of a century. She's one of the first credited poets in human history. So she was very influential, but she was the daughter of the king, and she was the son or the sister of the king after her father died. So, in antiquity, there are many examples. The first female pharaoh was Hatshepsut, and she ascended the throne. She ascended the throne because she was the regent to the pharaoh, and she shoved her son aside, and she claimed power. And she was a highly successful pharaoh. Her reign was very long.
So there's fewer examples then of women ascending to leadership organically.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And, to be fair, men aren't organically ascending to leadership either for most of human history. It's a very small sliver of society. It's the elites, right, historically, whether it's male or female. But what I would say about most female leaders in history is that there seems to be some great cultural, societal ambivalence about their leadership regardless of how successful they were. For example, with Hatshepsut, there's evidence of a systematic attempt to sort of modify, tweak, and erase her accomplishments from history. So while in Egyptian antiquity, they were, if a female ascended to pharaoh, it was okay, but it wasn't their preferred mode of politics.
So then maybe you make the argument that it is a sort of ingrained behavior that we, as human beings, may not want women in leadership, or is it something else?
That's hard to unpack and hard to answer. Succinctly for the purpose of purposes of a podcast.
Yes.
Take my class if you want to talk about it a little bit more. Power has historically been gendered male. So, and that the origins of that, there's differing opinions about the origins of why power, political power, military power is gendered male, but a lot of it has to do with the formation of complex societies. Before we had complex societies, there tended to be, scholars argue that there tended to be relatively egalitarian relationships between men and women. But when you get complex organized societies that have a hierarchical structure, that means in most of those cases, you get the development of patriarchal customs and norms where men are the formal political leaders. It's not that women are without power. It's just that their power is marginalized. And it tends to be that, men are the ones that are making the political decisions for whatever. And that is, and you get patriarchal cultures. And it's, there are some people that like to say, oh, well, there were matriarchal cultures in history. And actually, there's very little evidence for the existence of any true matriarchal cultures in human history.
That's fascinating. So over time then, are there examples of women that have risen to power either through an elected means or tell me about some of those?
Well, there's antiquity, obviously, closer to our more common times. I mean, Cleopatra comes to mind, right? Elizabeth I comes to mind. Sometimes Catherine the Great. And there were many queens in African nations prior to Euro colonization of Africa. So there are examples of women in power. Taking just the easiest one is Elizabeth I. She comes to power after Henry and her brother Edward, but she never marries. She is the so-called virgin queen. And, there's a reason she doesn't marry. Part of that reason is because married women, a woman who is married, her identity, her power, all of it is either subsumed by or shared with her husband. So it would attenuate her power. If she were to marry, she'd have to share power.
Yeah, she'd undercut herself.
She didn't want to share power. And in the same, kings didn't have to share their power with a queen, but a queen would be expected to share her power with the king.
So, all right, let's bring it now to the United States. The United States obviously has never had a woman in the top political office, which is the President of the United States, but we've had women as Supreme Court justices, and certainly in the executive branch, we've had a female vice president now. Some would argue that, well, we're a young nation, so we're still maturing in a certain way. I think I would, say the same. But is there something else to being at the top of the ticket, right? And being the president, that there's this reticence to a female leader in the United States? Or is it a combination of things that we just haven't had the right woman, run for president, which, we can discuss that as well. But What do you think it is? Are we as Americans so ingrained in this historical context of male-dominated patriarchal leadership that is where we feel comfortable, and thus we have not elected a woman? Or is it something else?
As with most of the questions you've asked, it's very complicated to answer it. There is no one right answer. There are a lot of moving parts to it. And there are a couple things that I can say. One, you hit it, is that the United States is a young country, comparatively speaking.
Yeah, people don't think of it as a young country.
No,
but
it
we
is
are, yeah.
in terms of that. So, I think that is a factor. One of the things that's also a factor about the United States is this notion of American exceptionalism, this mythology of America that is quite different from, for example, the mythologies surrounding European countries. So, nation states, whatever. The American mythology is one of conquest. It's one of manifest destiny. So that is in the American imagination. If you just think of, for example, the cowboy.
Sure.
For example, these things are, they're. I hate to say this, but they're gendered male, right? The American cowboy. When you conjure an image in your mind of American exceptionalism and things like that, it is the cowboy, male, white male. We have George Washington and the cherry tree, all of these things. So that frontier exceptionalism, American manifest destiny, all of those things kind of play into this mythology of America, plus other things. And the cowboy was made possible because of, policy, because of, government action of removal of people that were in the West, and whatnot. But there's
about Native Americans.
Yeah. There's this idea that, the rugged individual, male individual, goes out and conquers in the West, for example. He's also oftentimes alone, right? The reality was that he wasn't alone. There were homesteads out there. Well, if you have a homestead, you have women out there. You have women and children. A lot of this was made possible because there were women and children, and because there were policies that cleared the way for, the cowboy to go do what he was doing, right? So I think that there's this American mythology that is male, individualist. But there isn't a corresponding idea about women.
Other than wearing pink or something, right? And being maternal, right?
Well, I think that there's this historically in the United States. I mean, women were not thought to be politically minded.
Right. That
women tended the home and hearth, and the men were out in the world making the living, et cetera. So. But this is always really complicated, right? So, like, you take the American Revolution, for example. The American Revolution, we talk about the boycotts. Every student in the United States learns about, the Boston Tea Party. They learn about the boycotts during the revolution, leading up to the revolution. And, those valiant Americans, and those revolutionaries who dumped the tea into the harbor. What's lesser known about the boycotts, and the boycotts went on for over a decade, and the boycotts were incredibly successful. But one of the main reasons why the boycotts were successful and led to the revolution is because women adhered to the boycotts. Because most of the things that the colonists were boycotting were goods that were consumed in the home, sugar, tea, stuff like that, and women's refusal to colonist women's refusal to buy imported cloth from Britain, for example. You have what's known as the homespun movement, where women who had been buying factory-made cloth in Britain for a long time decide, no, we're going to make it domestically. We're not going to pay the tax, right? So, the boycotts were successful because women were politicized. They felt nationally, is the phrase, and they, their political consciousness was awakened. Famously, Abigail Adams admonishes John during the Constitutional Convention, remember the ladies. Yes, she writes that letter to him, but he doesn't. His response to her is to laugh at her. So
again, marginalized.
Yes, well, marginalized, but on a pedestal. The reality also is that many, many, many women couldn't adhere to those sorts of standards. And so, so women's activism, women's political consciousness, for example.
Suffrage, et cetera, yep.
Yeah. I mean, it existed, but it never had a legitimate avenue for expression. They were supposed to express their political feelings through the home by raising, good citizen children, for example. Mothers were supposed to inculcate their children with democratic values, small d democratic and small r Republican values. So motherhood, it's called Republican motherhood, small r. They were, supposed to raise children for this new government, to be aware of its exceptionalism and its uniqueness. So I think that women have always had a political consciousness. There just have not been the same sorts of avenues for women. I mean, women weren't being educated in the same way until well into the 19th century. So, they didn't have access to, they couldn't become lawyers. It was extremely difficult for them to become lawyers or doctors or professionals of any kind. So you don't start seeing, women having the same sorts of access to the structures of power that would enable them to do something like run for office.
Right.
Not only that, but women have always come up against the double shift, right? They're, sure, I would like to become a lawyer and run for office, yet I'm expected to do the work at home, be the primary caregiver, et cetera. So, there's always been barriers to women's entrance into any sort of meaningful public life, whether it's politics, whether it's the law, whether it's, medicine, science, what have you.
I think we would both agree that perhaps things don't happen as quickly as we would like, but as you lay out sort of the last, nearly 300 years in the country, there has been a movement toward getting women into a position, right? So talk about that, right? Where perhaps in, again, 2024, we look at it and we say, boy, we're so behind. Pay is still not equal, all of these different things. But over those almost 300 years, women have obtained the right to vote and gotten different rights. And if you look at it from more of a global perspective, we talked about it before, we're a young country, the evolution during that time is getting women to where they should be. So talk about that.
So that's
again, knowing that we would all love to see a world where we are truly equal and all of that. Yeah.
Right. Well, would we? Does everyone feel that way? I think that, so for the United States, in terms of gender equity, the United States ranks somewhere out of the 160 or so nations. Currently, the United States ranks about 50th in terms of gender equity and policy across the board. So there's a lag. There is a pronounced lag in the United States in terms of gender equity when you're looking globally.
Just for where the other countries, who are they? The top 10 countries, you don't have to name all
Please
of them.
don't make me name them all because I don't know them all.
European countries?
Yeah, most of them are European countries.
Who have had heads of state.
They
thinking
have.
of Germany, Angela Merkel recently.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Who there was just a recent article out about, I've been kind of following this tangentially. But, there is, again, when I was talking about Hatshepsut earlier, there is a bit of a campaign, if you will, to undermine
or minimize her
marginalize her contributions, to sort of say, well, it actually wasn't that great. Her policies were bad, and when that's done, that type of thing is more frequently occurs after you have a female ruler.
Interesting.
Also, if she happens to be on the left of the political spectrum, less so when they're on the right of the political spectrum.
Interesting. Okay.
But in terms like globally, right, there's some, it's mostly European countries. But the United States, for example, to date, I believe the statistic is about, of all the people who have served in Congress, since there's been a Congress, only 3% of them have been female. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, but you still don't have gender equity, right? You don't have the same number of women. In nations where, for Mexico, for example, there's, nations that have made it a priority to have equal gender representation in their governing bodies, in their legislatures, for example. They have achieved parity. Mexico has a law where you have to have the same amount of women representatives as male representatives. So in nations that have done that, you do tend to see greater gender equity.
More difficult to achieve, though, when you have an open election process, right? Because you can't just say, all right, well, there's a bucket for women or a bucket for men, or how does that work?
Well, you have to create a policy in which you have that. Some of that happens when you have, for example, in Canada, right? Justin Trudeau has a policy where it's like, I'm going to have the same amount of women in my cabinet as men, right? So it comes from the top. It also comes from the bottom, right? So, if you have to have, a policy that says X number of candidates have to be male, X number of candidates have to be female. Again, I apologize. We're speaking in very strictly binary terms here, and I recognize that that's not
but we
the
get
way.
it.
Yeah. So, but you have to have. So, if you're the Democratic Party, for example, and you're going to have a field of candidates that you're going to put into, run for office, half of them have to be female and half of them have to be male. So it's not just it's the party mechanisms, right, that have to find those, groom, find, train those types of candidates, right? So, but that is one way that you can get equal representation. One of the things about it, too, is that in the United States, there are barriers, certainly, to women entering formal politics. There are multiple barriers, and it's not the same for every person, right? But one of the underlying things that I think really hits to the heart of it is that women frequently don't see politics as a desirable career.
Or as an avenue to, make their mark.
Right.
They can do a better job doing something else.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. So what's I find ironic about that is that a lot of the policies, for example, that have come about that we all, I think, appreciate have come about because of women's political activism, women's grassroots political activism. Take one I was just looking at because I'm going to be teaching the environmental history course coming up is Love Canal. Love Canal, New York State, toxic waste, people dying, bringing the Love Canal issue to the public consciousness and lobbying legislators and, really making people aware of what was going on, that was led by women working class women in that neighborhood. You're poisoning my family.
Once again, though, coming back to your point,
coming from the family.
Issues of the home, issues of family, fascinating.
Bread and butter issues. And so, so there, you're poisoning my children. My neighborhood is a toxic waste dump, which it literally was. That was in the late 1970s, right? So, but they didn't see themselves as political activists, right? They were coming at it from, there's a good PBS documentary on this as well. But, they'll say, I didn't think of it in those terms. I just wanted my family to be healthy. I wanted this to not be happening.
So is it, as we think about the here and now, I think we would both agree it's necessary to get more women involved in the political process.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
But how do you make that case? How do you make that argument when, as you said, women still have barriers? They're still trying to keep one foot in the home and they're trying to keep one foot in their professional life. You have battled the same thing. You have a family too.
Yeah.
So how... And we're not going to solve it in the next few minutes, but what are the things we need to be thinking about?
I think that we need to I think education is enormous. I think, in reflecting over the last, as an American historian and a woman who studies grassroots political activism, education is at the heart of everything for me. I really think that we need to be educating people about how change happens. That everyday people, however you self-identify, right? Whether you're male, female, whatever, that everyday people can make a difference. Their voices are important. They can make a change. And to provide examples of how that happens and do it, in social sciences, do it in history classes, do it often. A lot of that is being done already. But in terms of specifically women's, women's political participation in terms of running for office as being candidates, I think that we need to, foster that sort of mentality in women, particularly young women. Older women tend to be more concerned about political issues than younger women do. Younger women, are less inclined to think that they need to do something to make a change. Older women are more like, you need to get out there and you need to be paying attention. And younger women, less so.
Put a bookmark on that. We're going to come back to it.
Yeah. So, I think younger women need to be encouraged. I think political parties need to do more to foster women of, whatever side of the aisle you're on, whatever your political persuasion you are, flying spaghetti monster, whatever, doesn't matter. But women need to be, made aware that this is a legitimate sort of, career, and if they're interested.
And not just for representation from a number perspective, right? That
right,
it's like, here's one woman and one man. It's diversity of thought, diversity of ideas, right?
Well, okay.
Perspective, etc.
Right. It's about perspective, but it's also about certain aptitudes, right? So if you survey American people, right? American people are surveyed about, the qualities you most value in a political candidate, right? And they were asked, about, the number one thing is honesty, right? So it's honesty, intelligence, and hardworking. Those are the top three. And when those people were asked, okay, so men or women, who is more honest? Who do you think is more intelligent? Who do you think is more hardworking? And women in all three of those categories, women score far higher than men do. So Of the top three qualifications that people have for political candidates, women outstrip men by a large margin. So there's this question, okay, so if women tick like 9 of the 10 boxes for what you want in a political candidate, but there are historically 3% of them in elected office at the federal level, that's a head scratcher. So why is that, right? So it comes down to women running for office. Mm-hmm. It comes down to, you think women have these traits, but then in the polling booth, maybe something else happens.
Fascinating. Right? I mean, look, at the top of the ticket, we've only had 2 in the history of the country. And to a certain point of view, Hillary Clinton did have the popular vote, right? And we can go on about the Electoral College. That's a different topic for a different day. But, maybe people did make that that calculus, right? This time around with Vice President Harris, they did not make that calculus, as it related to her. And maybe that's one of the reasons she, obviously lost the popular vote and the Electoral College and a whole host of other issues. But I'd said it before, I wanted to put a bookmark in something, and you said it about the mature woman. There is research that actually says mature women are uniquely suited and best suited to actually be in positions of leadership for all the reasons that you said. Talk about how that perspective and education can help us as a country maybe understand why we need to change our thinking a little bit.
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that. If you want mature women in positions of leadership, particular at any level, really, they need to start young.
Yeah.
So
it goes back to participation.
Yeah, it goes to, so women need to be, to see that this is, something that they can do, and that is attractive to them. The other thing too is the idea of women's voices. Women's voices, for example, sometimes, people might say in a survey, yes, women are more honest, intelligent, and hardworking, but political language, right, and political discourse has been incredibly male-dominated. So, for a woman to be successful in politics, she's got to thread a very particularly small needle, I think. And so for mature women, we had Nancy Pelosi, 2007. She becomes the highest ranking woman that we've, in Congress. She's third in line, right? And however you feel about her as a speaker, she was incredibly powerful politically. I think but the critiques of Pelosi are different than critiques of men. So women face, not only do they face, a career in a male-dominated field that is where the discourse is frequently gendered male. They face also, they are open to critiques that are somehow quite different than a male candidate.
And that's consistent through many lines of work, basically all lines of work. It's not unique to politics.
Yeah. Any woman who goes past a particular point in her career is going to face some of this stuff. It's not an uncommon thing.
So I think the message, or at least the commentary that you've provided, really, when we talk about the top of the ticket, and we talk about, does that glass ceiling get shattered in our lifetimes? A lot of it comes down to participation and involvement of women, which over time has progressed to the point that women are more politically active.
You see them more often. I just want to add this. You see greater numbers of women in political positions at lower levels.
Right. School boards, planning board, committee.
State and local governments, there's a really robust women's participation in state and local governments. And, the argument gets made that most politics is local.
It is local, yeah.
So, I think when we, so certainly when we're looking at the federal level,
yes,
right, there's the numbers are there, right? It's improving. It's definitely improving, and it's improved a lot over the last 100 years, significantly. But there's more room to grow there, I think. But at the state and local level, it is really robust. And that's really where you get people involved. And a lot of women come to state and local governments out of grassroots issues, whether it's school boards or local municipalities, being a mayor somewhere. I mean, it's because they care about the local community.
So as we're starting to wrap up our first episode of Bergen Banter with our wonderful history professor, Dr. Eubank, any closing thoughts on, right, we could go for another couple of days.
Sure. Let's not.
But, and I said it before, the glass ceiling, does it get shattered in our lifetime? Do we have a female president?
How long do you plan to live?
Well,
no, yeah, I think it does. I do think it does. I think it does, but I think it's also important to think about the significance of that. And for example, in Britain, Margaret Thatcher was the first female PM. And in the United States, we've had women. There are, in the United States, far more women involved politically and in political office who are on the other side of the aisle. So in the United States, I think if we do break that final glass ceiling, I think we're going to see a conservative.
Very interesting, very interesting. And especially as we go through the next 4 years, we know that President-elect Trump is term limited. He's no longer going to be able to run. So there is going to be an opening there. Traditionally, the vice president would have a window there or a beeline to the nomination. But Nikki Haley obviously might fit that mold. So maybe 4 years from now or 3 years from now, we'll start talking about that. And we'll bring you back on the podcast to talk
Happy
about
to come back.
Women in leadership in 2027, maybe 2028. But that's for a different day. This was Season 1, Episode 1. Thank you for being our first
Thanks
guest.
for having me.
Yeah, never mind the noise and the chatter. We're talking about facts and having an intelligent conversation here on Bergen Banter. We will see you next time.
Thank you, Larry.